The train screeched across the Texas prairie, its wheels screaming against rails hot enough to shimmer in the sun. Inside the boxcars, German prisoners pressed their faces to the barred slits, eyes stinging from sweat and dust. They had been told they were bound for punishment, for hunger, maybe even death. But as the train slowed and the brakes hissed, what filled their view was not the grey geometry of a prison wall. It was a man. One boot hooked on a fence rail, hat tilted low, chewing a blade of grass like he had all the time in the world. His spurs flashed once in the blinding light. The men inside blinked, not trusting what they saw. Cowboys, real ones. The kind they'd seen only on flickering film reels smuggled into Germany before the war. The absurdity cut through their fear for a moment. Some even laughed, dry and nervous. When the doors clanged open, the air rolled in thick with sagebrush and manure. It was not the smell of war, but of work, ordinary life continuing beneath an endless sky. They stumbled out, boots sinking into soil soft as ash compared to the cobblestones of Bremen or Hamburg. They expected jeers, rifles, snarling commands. Instead, the guards simply watched with that same quiet ease, hands resting on belts, sun bleaching the brims of their hats. One nodded as if greeting new ranch hands rather than captured soldiers. Children sat on fence rails, eyes wide at the sight of the enemy. Women in sunbonnets shaded their faces, whispering to one another. The prisoners shuffled in silence, feeling the burn of shame and disbelief all at once. Inside the camp, things were just as strange. No concrete towers, no machine gun nests bristling on the walls. Wooden barracks lined up in neat rows, a mess hall in the middle, fields stretching beyond where cattle grazed lazily under the heat. It looked less like a prison than a ranch interrupted by a war. The air smelled of coffee and simmering beef stew, an aroma so rich that one soldier's stomach twisted in confusion. He hadn't smelled beef in years. "My mother has not tasted meat since '41, he whispered. Another swallowed hard, unsure if this was a trick. When the cowboy who had first greeted them passed again, he didn't speak. He simply tipped his hat. That gesture, small, effortless, hit harder than any insult. It was not mockery but indifference. These men had been told they were monsters. Here they were barely remarkable. The cowboys' silence told them something more dangerous than hatred, that America was so sure of its power it didn't need to prove it. That night, lying on rough bunks, the prisoners whispered about what they had seen. Some insisted it was propaganda. Others stared at the cracks between the planks where starlight bled through and said nothing. For the first time, the idea took root that captivity might hold something worse than cruelty, reflection. The first morning broke sharp and gold over the prairie. A whistle cut the dawn, startling the Germans from their bunks. They braced for punishment, hard bread, thin soup, the ritual degradation they'd been warned about. Instead, the mess hall filled their senses with something unreal. Rows of wooden tables steamed with bowls of beef stew, thick and fragrant, tin trays stacked high with slices of cornbread. Coffee, black and bitter, poured endlessly into chipped mugs. For a long moment, no one moved. They waited for the blow, the mockery. But the guard by the door, hat tipped back, face half hidden in shadow, just gestured casually. Eat. Nothing more. The word felt like mercy and insult in one breath. A corporal lifted his spoon and sipped cautiously. The taste of fat and salt hit him so hard he closed his eyes. Another prisoner bit into cornbread and laughed under his breath. "It's sweet," he murmured, almost guilty. "My family hasn't seen white flour in 3 years." They ate silently, swallowing both food and shame. Letters written later carefully censored but still telling, spoke of this first meal. "Mother," one wrote, "do not worry for me. I eat more meat here than I did as a boy." Another added, "They give us coffee every day." Real coffee. The irony gnawed at them. They had marched for conquest, yet ate better in defeat. After breakfast came work, not the back-breaking torment they imagined, but real labor, farm work. With American men overseas, the country needed hands, and the Geneva Convention allowed agricultural assignments. So the prisoners marched out under a hard blue sky to harvest cotton, mend fences, load hay. At first, pride stiffened their backs. They moved clumsily, resentful, but the guards didn't shout. They showed. One cowboy lifted a hay bale easily, showing a young German how to grip and heave without tearing his muscles. The German copied him, embarrassed but grateful. Later in the barracks, he muttered to his bunkmate, "In Germany, no officer would show you how to work." He would only shout each man earned about 80 cents a day in camp credit, enough to buy cigarettes, chocolate, or soap. It seemed absurd. One joked bitterly, "I fought for Hitler and earned nothing. I pick cotton for a cowboy and get paid." The days fell into rhythm. Work, eat, rest, write. Some guards rode the fences on horseback, reins loose, spurs jingling faintly in the dust. The sound haunted the Germans, a music of unspoken freedom. On Sundays, local farmers who hired prisoners offered them lemonade or biscuits after a day's labor. One prisoner, gazing over a Texas field that reached the horizon, whispered, "I have never seen a land that does not end." The words carried no envy, only wonder. But within the barracks, the contrasts began to cut deep. Some men smiled too easily now, humming tunes they'd heard from the guards. Others clenched fists beneath blankets, calling them weak. The barbed wire enclosed them, but the real battle was inside, the slow cracking of certainty, the dangerous birth of doubt. By late summer, the rhythm of captivity had begun to feel unsettlingly normal. The Germans rose with the sun, marched to breakfast, and worked until the heat shimmered across the fields like invisible fire. They were prisoners, yes, but each day blurred a little more into something resembling life. After supper, men lounged outside the barracks, smoking or mending torn shirts. A cowboy's harmonica drifted from the guard line, lazy and melancholic. Some prisoners found themselves listening longer than they meant to, tracing the melody with quiet lips as though it might teach them something freedom never had. The Americans treated work as ritual, not punishment. They didn't bark orders. They demonstrated. When fences broke, they fixed them together. When cattle strayed, they herded side by side under the same indifferent sun. The guards seemed less like conquerors than caretakers of a vast, living rhythm that had no need for cruelty. The Germans, bred in ranks and hierarchy, struggled to read this kind of power. One officer, proud even in defeat, muttered one day, "They command without commanding." His comrade nodded silently. Payday came every 2 weeks, and men lined up for their credits. Paper money, only good within camp limits, but money all the same. With it, they bought razor blades, candy, postcards, and coffee grounds from the canteen. Some even purchased notebooks to practice English. A few scrawled the same words over and over: freedom, cowboy, home. It wasn't just curiosity. It was survival, the need to understand the strange dignity of their captors. But not all could stomach it. Within the barracks, small wars simmered. Hardliners still loyal to the Reich whispered that the Americans' kindness was a weapon, a trick to rot their pride. They called those who smiled at guards traitors. "They feed you to make you forget," one snarled. Yet, even as he spoke, his own cup of coffee steamed between his hands. The warmth betrayed him. Reports from camp officials later noted these fractures. Some prisoners were transferred away for stirring trouble. Others simply drifted toward quiet acceptance. The guards, most of them ranchers or farmhands drafted into service, saw it differently. "They're just men," one said, shrugging. "Same as us. Only difference is the uniform." The sun dropped fast on those plains, and the evenings turned gold, then violet. Through the fence, the Germans could see silhouettes of horses against the dying light, cowboys moving slow and deliberate, spurs glinting like embers. Sometimes the guards played cards near a lantern, laughter carrying across the dark. That laughter unsettled the prisoners more than any insult could. It was unbothered, unafraid, utterly free. Lying on his bunk one night, a young corporal whispered into the dark, "They treat us like men, not enemies." And that makes it worse. His bunkmate didn't answer. Outside, a coyote called. Inside, 50 hearts lay awake, caught between gratitude and guilt. Autumn crept in quietly. The prairie grass faded from green to brittle gold, and mornings carried the smell of frost. The prisoners had grown lean but strong, their hands calloused from labor that no longer felt like punishment. By now, they could sling hay, mend fences, and drive a team of mules almost as well as the Americans who watched them. And those Americans, those cowboys, seemed immune to the bitterness that war bred elsewhere. They carried themselves with that same unshakable ease, a confidence born not from rank, but from belonging. Some of the Germans had started to admire it. Others feared what that meant. During one long day repairing a corral, a young prisoner watched a cowboy untangle a rope snagged on a post. The man hummed while he worked, speaking softly to his horse as if it understood every word. The prisoner felt something twist inside him, not envy exactly, but recognition. He had spent years saluting officers who never smiled, who treated men as tools. Yet here was authority expressed through calm hands and patience. Later, he wrote in his notebook, "I saw more humanity in a cowboy's silence than in all our orders shouted." At night, the camp became a small, flickering world of its own. Guards and prisoners shared the same wind, the same smell of dust and livestock. The Germans began carving small figures from wood scraps, horses, boots, even miniature spurs. They bartered them for cigarettes or coffee, sometimes gifting them to guards who admired the craftsmanship. Music found its way in too, a harmonica on the American side, an accordion on the German side, melodies crossing the wire until they met somewhere in the middle of the dark. The strangest thing was how ordinary it all began to feel. Men who had once fought across deserts now debated baseball scores, mimicking what they heard from the guards. The barbed wire still cut the horizon, but inside it, the camp pulsed with something dangerously close to peace. A few even started to laugh at themselves. "If this is captivity," one said, "then our freedom back home was poorer." The words hung in the air, half joke, half confession. Not everyone could bear that thought. In some barracks, die-hard loyalists formed secret groups, trying to keep control over the others. They warned against infection by American weakness. They held meetings whispering about duty, honor, and the Reich that still stood, at least in their minds. But their voices grew thinner as the weeks passed. The men who worked in the fields, who drank the coffee, who saw the cowboy nod at them each morning, they were changing. Not in loyalty, perhaps, but in understanding. One evening, as the sun blared across the sky, a guard on horseback passed close to the fence. His spurs jingled, the leather of his saddle creaked, and dust rose around the hooves. The Germans paused their work, watching him disappear into the horizon. For a long moment, no one spoke. Then a voice said softly, "He moves like he owns the world." Another replied, "Maybe he just doesn't fear it." Winter came suddenly to the plains. The wind cut like glass through the gaps in the barracks' walls, and the mornings began with frost clinging to the edges of tin mugs. The prisoners woke to see their breath hanging in the cold air, each exhale a reminder of how far they were from home. Yet even then, the rhythm of the camp didn't break. Fires burned in the mess hall stoves, the smell of coffee rising like a promise. Guards stamped their boots, cowboys wrapped scarves around their necks, and the work continued. Some of the Germans began to study. The camp allowed lessons, English classes taught by local teachers, carpentry from guards who had once been craftsmen, even mathematics from prisoners themselves. In the evenings, the barracks glowed faintly with lamplight as men hunched over notebooks, tracing unfamiliar letters. "Hello," one wrote in careful script. "Coffee, cowboy." The sound of foreign syllables filled the room, mixed with the scratch of pencils and the hiss of the wind outside. It was a strange kind of education. Behind wire, under the eyes of supposed enemies, they were learning the language of the people who had defeated them. But it didn't feel like humiliation. It felt like discovery. One prisoner, a former student from Munich, wrote in his diary, "I have learned more in 1 month here than in all the years I spent listening to speeches." Music grew louder too. The accordion returned, joined by a violin smuggled into camp by a Red Cross parcel. The Germans played folk songs at first, their melodies heavy with homesickness. Then, slowly, they began to play the songs they heard from the Americans, cowboy tunes, gospel hymns, the easy swing of ranch music. Guards leaned against fences, listening. Sometimes they applauded. One night, a cowboy passed a harmonica through the wire. "You'll get more music out of it than I ever did," he said. The exchange was small, almost meaningless, yet it carried a weight the men couldn't explain. In the world they'd left behind, generosity had been rationed, measured in obedience. Here it appeared without reason. That night, the harmonica joined the orchestra of defeat, its reedy notes drifting across the cold. Not all hearts softened. Some prisoners mocked the music, saying it made them forget who they were. "We are soldiers, not farm hands," one growled. "We do not sing the enemy's songs." But even he caught himself humming as he stacked his blankets. The contradictions deepened. A man could curse America by day and dream of its open skies by night. The camp became a mirror, showing them not just who they were, but who they might have been without the weight of war. Through the bitter wind and the long nights, one truth began to settle quietly among them. Captivity had not broken them. It had shown them something their victory never could, the simple, unguarded power of a life without fear. By early spring, the wind softened and the earth began to breathe again. Grass pushed up between the fences, and the smell of wet soil filled the mornings. The prisoners moved with practiced ease now, hauling feed, repairing barns, digging irrigation trenches. The guards had grown familiar too, calling a few by nicknames that stuck. It was strange how routine had dissolved the barrier that war had built. A nod here, a joke there, small things that carried more disarmament than any treaty. One afternoon, after a long day of hauling hay, a cowboy and a young German stopped to rest by the fence. The cowboy offered him a tin cup of water, saying nothing. The German hesitated, then took it. The water was warm, metallic from the cup, but in that moment it tasted cleaner than any drink he'd ever had. When he tried to hand the cup back, the cowboy waved it off. "Keep it," he said. The German stared after him as he walked away, spurs chiming faintly in the dust. Later that night, he wrote in his journal, "He gave me his cup and did not look proud for doing so. I do not understand men like this." That sentiment, passed from bunk to bunk, began to define the camp. They had been trained to see their enemies as brutal and arrogant. Yet here, in this strange, open-air prison, power was quiet, patience was strength, and mercy came without warning. Rumors trickled through by late April. Germany was collapsing. The prisoners heard whispers of Allied armies sweeping across the Rhine, of cities burning, of surrender being only a matter of time. The news hit like a blow and a relief all at once. Some men wept quietly, faces buried in their hands. Others clenched their jaws and stared at the ground. A few, too proud to grieve, simply went back to work, swinging hammers harder than before. Outside the wire, life went on untouched by their despair. Cowboys saddled horses, dogs barked at dusk, and cattle bellowed in the fields. It was this steadiness that struck the Germans most deeply. The Reich had promised permanence and delivered ruin. These men, these cowboys who bowed to no officer and feared no whip, carried a different kind of permanence, the kind born of rhythm, not rule. When the surrender finally came, it was almost silent. No announcement, no ceremony, just a rumor confirmed by a guard who said quietly, "It's over." The words sank through the camp like a slow tide. Some cheered, others sat frozen, hollowed out. One man laughed, not from joy, but disbelief. "Over," he repeated, "and we are still here." That night, no one slept. The sky burned low with stars, and from somewhere beyond the fence came the soft strains of a harmonica. The prisoners listened in the dark, each man caught between loss and revelation. They had fought for an empire that promised greatness. In defeat, they had found something greater still, dignity. The weeks after surrender carried an eerie quiet. The guards' routines hardly changed. Coffee before sunrise, horses saddled, gates checked. But inside the wire, everything felt weightless. The prisoners no longer woke to orders. There were no more drills, no more rumors of exchange or punishment, just the slow drift of waiting for whatever came next. Some men packed what little they had, letters, carvings, scraps of paper covered in English words they would likely never speak again. Others spent hours staring at the horizon as if trying to memorize the light. It wasn't joy or relief they felt, but a kind of grief that came from understanding too late. They had been defeated, yes, but also educated, softened, reshaped by a world they were taught to hate. A few weeks later, the process of repatriation began. Trains arrived again, their metal bodies gleaming under the Texas sun. But this time, the men boarding them were not the same ones who had arrived. They climbed the steps quietly, carrying not rifles, but memories. Some had small carvings of horses tucked into their pockets. Others held folded notebooks of English phrases and cowboy songs scribbled phonetically between German lines. Letters from those final days captured their confusion with startling honesty. "I come back to you changed," one wrote to his mother. "The Americans did not beat me. They gave me bread and shook my hand. They let me work. They treated me like I was still a man." Another wrote, "They live harder than we do, but freer. Their discipline is not from fear. It comes from respect." The trains crawled eastward through the plains. Outside, America rolled past. Fields of wheat, cattle grazing, small white churches standing against the wind. Children waved from crossroads, not knowing the men behind the barred windows were their father's enemies. Every so often, a cowboy on horseback appeared on a ridge, framed by the sun, and the prisoners fell silent. Some pressed their faces to the glass, desperate to see a little longer, as if that image of the rider, the open land, could explain everything they had felt but never named. For many, that was the last glimpse of the life that had transformed them. They left behind not just a country, but a question. How could freedom be so quiet, so ordinary, so confident, It needed no flag or speech to prove itself. When they reached the ports, the air was damp and cold. The smell of salt replaced the scent of sage. As they boarded ships bound for Europe, one man turned back toward the west, eyes stinging. He murmured, "We thought we were the masters of the world. But they," he nodded faintly, as if toward every cowboy he had ever seen, "they are the ones who own it, because they don't need to." The ships pulled away, carrying them toward a homeland in ruins, and away from the strange, sunlit captivity that had quietly remade them. The journey home was long, and silence ruled the train cars. No one sang, no one boasted. The men sat with their thoughts, staring through grimy windows as the American countryside slid by one last time. They passed through small towns, laundry fluttering on lines, children chasing dogs across dusty yards, church bells marking the hour. It was all so simple, so unguarded. One man whispered, "This is what they fight for." Another answered quietly, "No, this is what they live for." Days later, they reached the harbor. Ships waited, gray and heavy, their decks crowded with other prisoners ready to sail east. Some men shuffled forward with a strange reluctance. They had spent years longing for home, yet now, standing on American soil for what might be the last time, they felt a pang of something like loss. A cowboy stood near the loading platform, reins in one hand, hat in the other. He nodded once as the line passed. The gesture, simple, wordless, felt like a farewell from the land itself. When the ships finally pulled away, the prisoners leaned on the rails and watched the coastline shrink into mist. No cheers, no songs of return, just a quiet weight in their chests. One officer murmured, "We leave our shame behind, but also something more." His comrade asked what he meant. The officer didn't answer. He only kept watching until the horizon swallowed the last trace of land. Back in Europe, the contrast was brutal. Germany lay in ruin. Cities were reduced to rubble and smoke. Families rationed bread, traded for coal, waited for letters that never came. For the returning prisoners, it was like stepping from sunlight into shadow. They brought back not riches but stories, stories of cowboys and coffee, of generosity that mocked the cruelty they had once believed necessary. Some told these stories in whispers, afraid of being misunderstood. Others shared them openly, unable to hold them in. In the 1950s, something remarkable began to happen. Across West Germany, small cowboy clubs appeared. Former POWs, now farmers or mechanics, gathered in fields to ride horses, strum guitars, and wear wide-brimmed hats. To outsiders, it looked absurd, a defeated nation playing dress-up in the clothes of its former enemy. But to the men who had lived behind barbed wire under the Texas sun, it was more than nostalgia. It was reverence, a way of remembering a freedom they had felt, if only for a moment. Historians later called it the cowboy effect, a quiet cultural echo that rippled through post-war Germany. It wasn't about politics or propaganda. It was about the discovery that power could exist without cruelty, that dignity could survive defeat, and that freedom wasn't something shouted. It was something lived, worn like dust on the boots of a man who leaned on a fence and didn't need to prove a thing. Years passed, and the memory of the war began to fade. But for those who had lived behind the fences of the American camps, certain images never left. They remembered the dust curling up beneath the hooves of horses, the smell of cornbread and coffee, the steady rhythm of men who worked not because they were ordered to, but because it was part of who they were. Some of the former prisoners tried to explain it to their families, but words rarely did it justice. "You cannot understand," one man told his son. "They lived differently. They breathed differently. For many of these men, life in post-war Germany was heavy with contradiction. They were home, yet restless. Factories rebuilt, streets filled again, and the country began to hum with the energy of reconstruction. But at night, some of them found themselves dreaming of open plains, of sunlight on fences, of cowboys who tipped their hats without arrogance. In the cold winters of the new Germany, they missed that warmth, both the literal heat of the Texas sun and the invisible warmth of dignity given freely. A few began to write. Memoirs appeared in quiet corners of post-war literature, simple, unadorned, but striking. One man wrote, "We feared beatings and found none. We expected cruelty and received bread. We waited for hate and were met with indifference. It was this indifference, calm and certain, that changed us." Another, reflecting decades later, said, "The cowboy taught me more about freedom than all my generals." American historians were slow to notice. To them, the camps were footnotes, brief lines in the larger narrative of victory. But for the men who had lived inside, they were more than holding pens. They were classrooms, sanctuaries, contradictions carved into memory. Those who returned to visit the United States years later often sought out the sites where their camps once stood. Many found only open land, fences long since gone, cattle grazing where their barracks had once been. Yet standing there, they said they could still hear it, the faint jingle of spurs, the echo of boots in dust, the whistle that once woke them to a life they hadn't known could exist. One former prisoner described it best. "We had been told that strength came from fear. But in America, I saw strength born from peace." The cowboy was not afraid because he belonged to nothing but the land. He did not need to dominate it, he lived with it. That was freedom. The irony was sharp. Men who had fought for conquest discovered liberty only in defeat, from those who conquered without cruelty. And perhaps that was the quiet triumph of the cowboy, the power to turn even prisoners into witnesses of a different way of living. The years turned, and the story of the German prisoners faded into the dust of history. But for those who had lived it, it never disappeared. It was more than a tale of war. It was a lesson written in sunlight, barbed wire, and the quiet dignity of men who wore boots instead of uniforms. Many of those former POWs spent the rest of their lives trying to explain what they had seen in those ranches and small towns scattered across America. They spoke not of battles or defeats, but of moments, of the cowboy who tipped his hat, of the rancher who said "good job" to a man who had once fought against him, of the steady sound of horses breathing under the moon. They realized something profound. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't march. It doesn't shout. It just is. It moves like dust over open fields, like a hand offered without demand, like the calm gaze of a man who needs no master. The Germans had learned this truth not from lectures or propaganda, but from the living example of the cowboy, a symbol so deeply American that it transcended words. When the last of those men grew old, some still gathered in barns or community halls across Germany, their hands rough, their hair silver. They strummed guitars and sang the cowboy songs they'd once heard drifting through Texas nights. It wasn't imitation anymore. It was gratitude. For them, the cowboy was not a fantasy. He was proof that strength and kindness could live in the same man. And maybe that's why this story still matters. In a world that often confuses noise for power, these men learned, through defeat, that the truest power is quiet. It doesn't need to humiliate or destroy. It simply stands its ground, like a cowboy at sunset, unshaken by the horizon. So when you picture those trains rolling east, filled with men who arrived as enemies and left as witnesses, remember what they carried home, not bitterness, but a seed of understanding, They had been conquered by a freedom so effortless it could not be taught, only felt. If this story reached you, let it linger a moment. Ask yourself, what does freedom look like today? Is it still the loudest voice, or is it the calm hand steady on the reins? Because sometimes the strongest people are the ones who never need to prove it. And if you want more forgotten stories like this, real moments where history turned quietly instead of violently, make sure you subscribe, share this story, and leave a comment about what freedom means to you. Every story we tell keeps history alive, not as numbers, but as human truth. The trains disappeared long ago, the cowboys faded into photographs, but the lesson remains. Real power doesn't shout. It tips its hat, smiles once, and rides off into the light.